Book 1, Ancient Philosophy. Part 1, The Pre-Socratics. Chapter 1, The Rise of Greek Civilization. In all of history, nothing is so surprising or so difficult to account for as the sudden rise of civilization in Greece. Much of what makes civilization had already existed for thousands of years in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, had spread thence to neighboring countries, but certain elements had been lacking until the Greeks supplied them. What they achieved in art and literature is familiar to everybody, but what they did in the merely purely intellectual realm is even more exceptional. They invented mathematics and science and philosophy. They first wrote history as opposed to mere annals. They speculated freely about the nature of the world and the ends of life without being bound in the fetters of any inherited orthodoxy. What occurred so astonishing that until very recent times men were content to gape and talk mystically about the Greek genius. It is possible, however, to understand the development of Greece in scientific terms, and it is well worthwhile to do so. Philosophy begins with Thales, who fortunately can be dated the fact that he predicted an eclipse, which according to the astronomers occurred in the year 585 BC. Philosophy and science, which were not originally separate, were therefore born together at the beginning of the 6th century. What had been happening in Greece and neighboring countries before this time, any answer must be, in part conjectural, but archaeological. During the present century it has given us more knowledge than was possessed by our grandfathers. The art of writing was invented in Egypt about the year 4000 BC, and in Babylonia not much later. In each country, writing began with pictures of the objects intended. These pictures quickly became conventionalized so that the words were represented by ideograms, as they still are in China. In the course of thousands of years, the numerous system developed into an alphabetic writing. The early development of civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia was due to the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, which made agriculture very easy and very productive. The civilization was in many ways similar to that which the Spaniards found in Mexico and Peru. There was a divine king of despotic powers in Egypt. He owned all the land. There was a polytheistic religion with a supreme god to whom the king had specially intimate relation. There was a military aristocracy and also a priestly aristocracy. The latter was often able to encroach on the royal power. If the king was weak or if he was engaged in a difficult war, the cultivators of the soil were serfs belonging to the king, the aristocracy, or the priesthood. There was a considerable difference between Egyptian and Babylonian theology. The Egyptians are preoccupied with death and believe that the souls of the dead descended into the underworld where they are judged by Osiris according to the manner of their life on earth. They thought that the soul would ultimately return to the body. This led to mummification and to the construction of splendid tombs. The pyramids were built by various kings at the end of the 4th millennium BC and beginning of the 3rd. After this time, Egyptian civilization became more and more stereotyped and was conquered by Semites named Hyksos, who ruled the country for about 2 centuries. They left no permanent mark on Egypt, but their presence there must have helped to spread Egyptian civilization in Syria and Palestine. Babylonian had a more warlike development than Egypt. At first, the ruling race were not Semites, but Sumerians, whose origin is unknown. They invented cuneiform writing, which conquering Semites took over from them. There was a period when there were various independent cities which fought with each other, but in the end, Babylon became supreme and established an empire. The gods of other cities became subordinate, and Marduk, the god of Babylon, acquired a position like that held by Zeus in the Greek pantheon. The same sort of thing had happened in Egypt, but at a much earlier time. The religions of Egypt and Babylonia, like other ancient religions, were originally fertility cults. The earth was female, the sun male, the bull was also regarded as an embodiment of male fertility, and bull gods were common. In Babylon, Ishtar, the earth goddess, was supreme among female divinities. Throughout Western Asia and Greek Mother was worshipped under various names. When Greek colonists in Asia Minor found temples to her, they named her Artemis and took over the existing cult. This is the origin of Diana of the Ephesians. Christianity transformed her into the Virgin Mary, and it was a council of Ephesus that legitimated the title Mother of God as applied to Our Lady. Where a religion was bound up with the government of an empire, political motives did much to transform. In its primitive features, a god or goddess became associated with the state and had to give not only an abundant harvest, but victory in war. A rich priestly caste elaborated the ritual and the theology and fitted together into a pantheon the several divinities of the component parts of the empire. Through association with government, the gods also became associated with morality. Lawgivers received their codes from the gods, thus a breach of the law became an impiety. The oldest legal code still known is that of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, about 2100 BC. This code was asserted by the king to have been delivered to him by Marduk. The connection between religion and morality became continually closer throughout ancient times. Babylonian religion, unlike that of Egypt, was more concerned with prosperity in this world than with happiness in the next. Magic, divination, and astrology, though not peculiar to Babylonia, were more developed than elsewhere, and it was chiefly through the Babylon that acquired their hold on later antiquity. From Babylon come some things that belong to science, the division of the day into 24 hours and the circle into 360 degrees. Also, the discovery of a cycle in eclipses, which enabled lunar eclipses to be predicted with certainty, and solar eclipses with some probability. This Babylonian knowledge, as we shall see, was acquired by Thales. The civilization of Egypt and Mesopotamia were agricultural, and those of the surrounding nations at first were pastoral. A new element came with the development of commerce, which was at first almost entirely maritime. Weapons until about 1000 BC were made of bronze, and nations which did not have the necessary metals on their own territory were obliged to obtain them by trade or piracy. Piracy was temporarily expedient, and where social and political conditions were fairly stable, commerce was found to be more profitable. In commerce, the island of Crete seems to have been the pioneer for about 11 centuries, say from 2500 BC to 1400 BC. An aristocratically advanced culture called the Minoan existed in Crete, which survives of Cretan art, gives an impression of cheerfulness and almost decadent luxury, very different from the terrifying gloom of Egyptian temples. Of this important civilization, almost nothing was known until the excavations of Sir Arthur Evans and others. It was a maritime civilization in close touch with Egypt, except during the time of the Hyksos. From Egyptian pictures, it is evident that the very considerable commerce between Egypt and Crete was carried on by Cretan sailors. This commerce reached its maximum about 1500 BC. The Cretan religion appears to have had many affinities with the religions of Syria and Asia Minor, but in art there were more affinity with Egypt, though Cretan art is a very original and amazingly full of life. The center of the Cretan civilization was the so-called Palace of Minos at Knossos, of which memories lingered in the traditions of classical Greece. The palaces of Crete were very magnificent, but were destroyed about the end of the 14th century BC, probably by invaders from Greece. The chronology of the Cretan history is derived from Egyptian objects found in Crete and Cretan objects found in Egypt. Throughout our knowledge is dependent on the archaeological evidence. The Cretans worshipped a goddess, or perhaps several goddesses. The most indubitable goddess was the mistress of animals. She was a huntress and probably the source of the classical Artemis. Sheila, or another, was also a mother. The only male deity apart from the master of animals is her young son. There is some evidence of the belief in an afterlife in which, as in the Egyptian belief, deeds on earth receive reward or retribution, but on the whole, the Cretans appear from their art to have been cheerful people, not much oppressed. Like gloomy superstitions, they were fond of bullfights at which female as well as male toreadors performed amazing acrobatic feats. The bullfights were religious celebrations, and Sir Arthur Evans thinks that the performers belong to the highest nobility. The surviving pictures are full of movement and realism. The Cretans had a linear scripture, but it was not been deciphered. At home, they were peaceful, and their cities were unwalled, and no doubt they were defended by sea power. Before the destruction of the Minoan culture, it spread about 1600 BC, the mainland of Greece, where it survived through gradual stages of degeneration until about 900 BC. This mainland civilization is called the Mycenaean. It is known throughout the tomes of kings and also through the fortresses on hilltops, which show more fear of war than had existed in Crete. Both the tomes and fortresses remain to impress the imagination of classical Greece. The older art products in the palaces are either actually of Cretan workmanship or closely akin to those of Crete. The Mycenaean civilization, seen through a haze of legend, is that which is depicted in Homer. There is much uncertainty concerning the Mycenaeans. Did they owe their civilization to being conquered by the Cretans? Or did they speak Greek? Or were they an earlier indigenous race? No certain answer to these questions is possible, but on the whole, it seems probable that they were conquerors who spoke Greek, and that at least the aristocracy consisted of fair-haired invaders from the north, who brought the Greek language with them. The Greeks came to Greece in successive waves, from the first Minoans, then the Uaeans, and last the Dorians. The Minoans appear through conquerors to have adopted the Cretan civilization pretty completely, as later the Romans adopted civilization of Greece, but the Minoans were disturbed and largely disposed by the successors of the Uaeans. The Uaeans are known from Hittite tablets found at Boghaz-Kehu to have had a large organized empire in the 14th century BC. The Mycenaean civilization, which had been weakened by the warfare of the Minoans and the Uaeans, was particularly destroyed by the Dorians, the last Greek invaders, whereas previous invaders had largely adopted the Minoan religion. The Dorians retained the original Indo-European religion of their ancestors. The religion of the Mycenaean times, however, lingered on, especially in the lower classes, and the religion of classical Greece was a blend of the two. Although the above account seems probable, it must be remembered that we do not know whether the Mycenaeans were Greeks or not. What we do know is that their civilization decayed not about the time when it ended in the superseded bronze that for some time seized supremacy past the Phoenicians. Both during the later part of the Mycenaean age and after its end, some of the invaders settled down and became agriculturalists. While some pushed on first into the islands of Asia Minor and then into Sicily and southern Italy, where they founded cities that lived by maritime commerce, it was in those maritime cities that Greeks first made qualitatively new contributions to civilization. The supremacy of Athens came later and was equally associated when it came with naval power. The mainland of Greece is mountainous and largely infertile, but there are many fertile valleys with easy access to the sea, but cut off by the mountains from the easy land communication with each other. In these valleys, little separate communities grew up, living by agriculture and centering around a town generally close to the sea. In such circumstances, it was natural that as soon as the population of any community grew too great for its internal resources, those who could not live on the land should take to seafaring. The cities of the mainland founded colonies, often in places where it was much easier to find subsistence than it had been at home. Thus, in the earliest historical period of Greece of Asia Minor, Sicily and Italy were much richer than those of the Greek mainland. The social system was very difficult in different parts of Greece. In Sparta, a small aristocracy subsisted on large labor of oppressed serfs of a different race. In the four agricultural regions, the population consisted mainly of the farmers cultivating their own land with the help of their families. But where commerce and industry flourished, the free citizens grew rich by the employment of slaves, male in the mines and female in the textile industry. These slaves were in Inoan of surrounding barbarian population and were, as a rule, first acquired in war. With increasing wealth went increasing isolation of respectable women, who in later times had little part in civilized aspects of Greek life, except in Sparta. There was a very general development, first from a monarchy to aristocracy, then to the alternation of tyranny and democracy. The kings were not absolute like those of Egypt and Babylonia. They were advised by the council of elders and could not transgress custom with impunity. Tyranny did not mean necessarily bad governments, but only the rule of a man whose claim to power was not hereditary. Democracy meant governments by all the citizens, among whom slaves and women were not included. The early tyrants, like the Medici, acquired their power through the richest members of their respective plutocracies. Often the source of their wealth was the ownership of gold and silver mines, made them more profitable by the new institution of coinage, which came from the kingdom of Lydia, adjacent to Ionia. Coinage seems to have been invented shortly before 700 BC. One of the most important results to the Greeks of commerce or piracy at the first two are scarcely distinct was the acquisition of the art of writing. Although writing was existed in thousands of years in Egypt and Babylonia, the Minoan Cretans had a script which had not been deciphered. There is no conclusive evidence that the Greeks knew how to write until about the 10th century BC. They learned the art from the Phoenicians, who, like the other inhabitants of Syria, were exposed to both Egyptian and Babylonian influences who held the supremacy in maritime commerce until the rise of Greek cities of Ionia, Italy, and Sicily. In the 14th century, writing to Akhenaten, the heretic king of Egypt, Syrians still use Babylonian cuneiform, but Hiram of Tyre, 969936, used the Phoenician alphabet, which probably developed out of the Egyptian script. The Egyptians used their first appear picture writing. Gradually, the pictures, much conventionalized, came to represent syllables, the first syllables of the names of the things pictured, and at last, single letters on the principle of A was an archer who shot at a frog. This last step, which was not taken of any completeness by the Egyptians themselves, but by the Phoenicians, gave the alphabet with all its advantages. The Greeks, borrowing from the Phoenicians, altered the alphabet to suit their language and made the important innovation of adding vowels instead of having only consonants. There can be no doubt that the acquisition of the convenient method of writing greatly hastened the rise of Greek civilization. The first notable product of the Hellenic civilization was Homer. Everything about Homer is conjectural, but the best opinion seems to be that he was a series of poets rather than an individual. Probably the Iliad and the Odyssey between them took about 200 years to complete. Some say from 750 to 550 BC, while others hold that Homer was nearly complete at the end of the 18th century. The Homeric poems, in their present form, were brought to Athens by Pisistratus, who reigned with intermissions from 560 to 527 BC. From his time onward, the Athenian youth learned Homer by heart, and this was the most important part of their education. In some parts of Greece, notably in Sparta, Homer had not the same prestige until a later date. The Homeric poems, like the courtly romances of the later Middle Ages, presented the point of view of a civilized aristocracy, which ignores the plebeian various superstitions that are still rampant among the populace. In much later times, many of these superstitions rose again to the light of day. Guided by anthropology, modern writers have come to the conclusion that Homer, so far from being primitive, was an exaggerator, a kind of 18th century rationalizer of ancient myths holding up an upper class ideal of urban enlightenment. The Olympian gods who represent religion in Homer were not only objects of worship among the Greeks either in that time or later, there were other darker and more savage elements in the popular religion which were kept at bay by the Greek intellect at its best, but lay in wait to pounce in moments of weakness or terror in the time of decadence. Beliefs which Homer had discarded proved to have persisted, half buried throughout the classical period. This fact explains many things that would otherwise seem inconsistent and surprising. Primitive religion everywhere was tribal rather than personal. Certain rites were performed which were intended by a sympathetic magic to further the interests of the tribe, especially in respect to fertility. Vegetable, animal, and human, the winter solstice was a time when the sun had to be encouraged not to go on diminishing in strength. Spring and harvest also called for appropriate ceremonies. These were often such to generate great collective excitements in which individuals lost their sense of separateness and felt themselves at one with the whole tribe. All over the world, at a certain stage of religious evolution, sacred animals and human beings are ceremonially killed and eaten in different religions and regions. This stage occurs at a very different dates. Human sacrifice usually lasted longer than the sacrificial eating of human victims. In Greece, it was not yet extinct at the beginning of historical times. Fertility rites, without such cruel aspects, were common throughout Greece. The Eleusinian mysteries, in particular, were essentially agricultural in their symbolism. It must be admitted that the religion in Homer is not very religious. The gods are completely human, differing from men only in being an immortal and possessed of superhuman powers. Morally, there is nothing to be said for them, and it is difficult to see how they can have inspired so much awe. In some passages supposed to be laid, they are treated with a Voltairean irreverence. Such genuine religious feeling as is to be found in Homer is less concerned with the gods of Olympus than with mere shadowy beings such as fate or necessity or destiny, to whom even Zeus is subject. Fate exercised a great influence on all Greek thought, and perhaps it was one of the sources from which science derived the belief in natural law. The Homeric gods were the gods of conquering aristocracy, not the useful fertility gods of those who actually tilled the soil. As Gilbert Murray says, the gods of most nations claim to have created the world. The Olympians make no such claim. The most they ever did was to conquer it, and when they have conquered their kingdoms, what do? They attend to the government? Do they promote agriculture? Do they practice trades and industries? Not even a bit. Why should they do any honest work? They find it easier to live on their revenues and blast the thunderbolts the people who do not pay. They are conquering chieftains, royal buccaneers. They fight and feast and play and make music. They drink deep and roar with laughter at the lame smith who waits on them. They are never afraid except of their own king. They never tell lies except in love and war. Homer's human heroes equally are not very well behaved. The leading family is the house of Pelops, but it did not succeed in setting a pattern of happy family life. Tentos, the Asiatic founder of the dynasty, began its career by a direct offense against the gods. Some said by trying to shoot them into eating human flesh. That is his own son, Pelops. Pelops, having been miraculously restored to life, offended in his turn. He won his famous chariot race against Oenobios, king of Pisa, to the convenience of the later charioteer Myrtilios, and then got rid of the confederate whom he had promised a reward. Their flinging him into the sea, the curse descended to his sons Atreus and Thyestes, in the form of the Greeks called Ate, a strong if not actually irresistible impulse to crime. Thyestes corrected his brother's wife, and thereby managed to steal the luck of the family, the famous golden-fleeced ram. Atreus in turn secured his brother's banishment, and recalling him under the pretext of reconciliation, feasted on the flesh of his own children. The curse was now inherited by Atreus' son Agamemnon, who offended Artemis by killing a sacred stag, sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia to appease the goddess and obtain a safe passage to Troy for his fleet, and was in turn murdered by his faithless wife Clytemnestra and her paramour Aegisthus, a surviving son of Thyestes. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, in turn avenged his father by killing his mother and Aegisthus. Homer has finished achievement was a product of Inoa, i.e., a part of Hellenic Asia Minor and the adjacent islands sometime during the 6th century at latest. The Homeric poems began fixed in their present form. It was also during the century that Greek science and their present form, Greek science and philosophy and mathematics began. At the same time, events of a fundamental importance were happening in other parts of the world. Confucius, Buddha, and Zoroaster, if they ever existed, probably belonged the same century. In the middle of the century, the Persian Empire was established by Cyrus towards its close Greek cities of Ionia, to which the Persians had allowed limited autonomy, made a fruitless rebellion which was put down by Darius, and their best men became exiles. Several of the philosophers of this period were refugees who wandered from city to city in the still unenslaved parts of the Hellenic world, spreading a civilization that until then had been mainly confined to Ionia. They were kindly treated in their wanderings. Xenophanes, who flourished in the later parts of the 6th century, who was also a refugee, says, "This is the sort of thing we should say by fireside in the winter times. We lie on soft couches after a good meal, drinking sweet wine and crunching chickpeas. Of what country are you, and how old are you, good sir? And how old were you when the Mede appeared?" The rest of Greece succeeded in preserving the independence at the battles of Salamis and Plataea, after which Ionia was liberated for a time. Greece was divided into a large number of small independent states, each consisting of a city with some agricultural territory surrounding it. The level of civilization was very different in parts of the Greek world, and only in the minority of cities contributed to the total of the Hellenic achievements. Sparta, of which I shall have much to say later, was important in military sense, but not culturally. Corinth was rich and prosperous, a great commercial center. It was not prolific in great men. Then there were purely agricultural rural communities such as the proverbial Arcadia, which townsmen imagined to be idyllic, but which really was full of ancient barbaric wars.
The inhabitants worshipped Pan and multiple fertility pots in which often a mere square pillar did duty in place of statue of the god. The goat was a symbol of fertility because the peasants were too poor to possess bulls. The food was scarce. The statue of Pan was beaten. Similar things are still done in remote Chinese villages. There was a clan of